number of years ago, the three standard-setting bodies realized that the world was no longer quite so neatly divided into banking, securities, and insurance. And the growth of financial conglomerates meant that there were some companies who had a foot in two camps or even straddled all three camps and were providing financial services across the three sectors. And of course, you would have seen over the past few years great product convergence where products look more like each other, having the same functional outcome, whether they start as a banking, insurance, or securities product. As a result of that thinking, they formed a new body called the Joint Forum. So the Joint Forum comprises senior representatives from the Basel Committee, IOSCO, and the IAIS, which comes together to consider on a global basis cross-sectoral issues, issues that go across the three parts of the financial economy. Financial regulators have been concerned for some time about outsourcing by financial services firms. What should a bank, for that matter an insurance company or any other financial institution, what should they be allowed to outsource, and what requirements for governance ought there be around outsourcing contracts? It's one of those examples where it really didn't make any sense for there to be specific requirements for banking, different ones for insurance, and different for securities. So the Joint Forum was asked to come up with some cross-sectoral principles that would regulate or govern outsourcing contracts by financial firms. That was a piece of work that I chaired. So once we had come up with some draft principles, we put them out for consultation globally. We got some feedback. We amended the proposals. And then we put them forward for the standing set of bodies to adopt. Those principles were adopted then. Because they're adopted by the standard-setting bodies, that means that the national regulators around the world are then expected to implement them. I was asked to chair a study on the sale and distribution of retail products, or rather investment products, to retail clients, and look at what the regulatory requirements were across the three sectors and what the industry experience was and the industry practice was across some 13 or so countries involving 90 financial firms, financial institutions. We particularly were interested in looking at a sector-by-sector distinction, and what the study showed was that both at a regulatory level and at an industry practice level, the insurance sector lagged behind the others in many of the areas. Things such as dealing with conflicts of interest, product disclosure, disclosing the remuneration basis of sales agents, the insurance industry didn't perform as well as the other two sectors. Things were a bit better for banks and for the sales of products through banks, and the best results were in respect of sales of securities and funds, involving securities firms, fund houses, advisors, and financial planners. So you operate from a position of relative strength in respect of those sorts of issues. Two things that stood out from the study were that even in those areas or those parts of the industry that performed well, there were two areas in particular that needed to be improved. One was that the issue of remuneration needed to be tackled in two ways. The study found that in institutions that had a tied agency force, there wasn't enough consideration of the compliance and the conduct of business performance of those agents when their remuneration was calculated. In other words, some institutions were simply working on a sales basis. If you make the sales, you get your commission. The second issue was compliance and ethics issues generally, where we looked across the performance of the 90 firms, and while some of them were very good, there was a pretty clear indication that there needed to be improvements made in respect of dealing with conflicts of interest. Firstly, disclosing them, and secondly, managing them. So that was another highlight that came out in the report. One of the other things that the report noted was that there was a strong correlation between levels of regulation and industry practice. And so that brings me to the first challenge that I'd like to leave with you today. And that is, to what extent do you want the shape of your industry to be governed by regulators, or to what extent do you want to have a say in that shape yourself? To what extent do you want to be regulatory driven, and to what extent do you want to have aspirational standards and move the industry along without the regulators having to push you to do so? I think that the FPSB has quite a good story to tell in many of the areas that I've discussed, and can argue from a position of strength in respect of those issues. A critical question, I think, is the extent to which you're prepared to go beyond minimum standards, and so challenge some regulators in their thinking, given the matters that are under consideration right now. I also think that the FPSB needs to consider whether its position on remuneration is one that should be ahead of the curve or be pushed along by regulation. As I mentioned before, some regulators are moving quite aggressively on this issue, and I think others are sure to follow. And then there's the question within my question. I said, to what extent do you want the shape of your industry to be driven by regulators? Or do you really want to be known as a profession rather than an industry? I know that that is one of the goals, a key goal of the FPSB. The fact is, though, that at the moment in the regulatory community, they do talk about the legal profession, they do talk about the accounting profession, but they do talk about the financial planning industry. And you're not yet at the stage where regulators would recognize financial planning as a distinct profession. Even worse, in thinking about what to do in respect of the financial planning industry, regulators consult the legal profession and the accounting profession. We need to make sure that they're consulting with you and that you have a strong voice at the table. Here's my list of some of the hallmarks of being a profession. First, a professional is marked by having a fiduciary duty. They put the client first. That's something that I think is easy to say, a little bit more difficult to do. It's probably easy to put the client first in some things, or even in many things, but if you truly have a fiduciary duty, the duty of a fiduciary under the law is to put the client first, even ahead of your own interests. You need to think about what that actually means and how that plays out in your own businesses. Second, a professional is marked by qualifications and having a strong code of standards or code of ethics that it has to meet. Here, I think the FPSB stands up very well. If you look around the world, professionals are usually paid by the client, and they're paid directly for the advice or the service that they provide. They're not usually paid by a third party. And then the fourth thing is one that's perhaps a little bit more difficult to describe. It's the sort of higher order that professionals say they respond to. They will say, well, we have this sort of higher code. It's the reason that we joined the business in the first place. It's not to do with money. It's probably got something to do with ethics, something to do with having a fiduciary duty. But it's the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning and makes you go to work and want to help people. It's something that I think nurses have in abundance, dentists probably less so. Whoa. So what I'd like to leave you with just now is to think about three things. The first is, do you want to be a profession or do you want to be an industry? And if it's a profession that you want to be, what are the things that you need to do differently to get from one place to the other? And what is it that you can do to demonstrate your validity as a profession to regulators and your value as professionals to your clients? Secondly, do you want to be pushed along by regulators, or do you want to be ahead of the curve and shape things yourself? Let me tell you that in respect of the sort of issues we're talking about today, at a global level, there's no one else that IOSCO is speaking to on these sorts of issues at a global level. That space is vacant. There's no one to whom they automatically turn to discuss these issues with. And I think if the FPSB shows leadership on the sort of issues we've been talking about, disclosures, commissions, remuneration practices, then you'll find the doors of the global standard-setting bodies are open to you to have those sorts of discussions. And that brings me to the third part, the thing that I'd like you to think about. It needs to be recognized that the world is getting smaller and that regulatory standards are converging and becoming more consistent around the world. And there is, I think, an opportunity to look beyond self and national interest and engage on global issues with global bodies on behalf of a global profession.